Hi, welcome. This is Pete Calabrese. I'm CEO of CanAm Investor Services. CanAm Investor Services is the wholly owned broker-dealer affiliate, CanAm Enterprises, which is one of the largest and certainly most successful regional centers in the history of the EB-5 program. I have the distinct pleasure of being joined today by Mr. Christian Triantaphyllis, partner, Jackson Walker in Houston, Texas, member of the IIUSA Board of Directors, as well as a member of the EB-5 ALA committee. Tremendous honor to have you. Thank you so much, Christian, for taking the time.
Thank you, Pete. Very glad to be chatting with you and be speaking on this very interesting topic.
Likewise, yeah. So we're here to talk to you guys today about a really important topic, I think, in the EB-5 industry, which is that of investing while making a partial investment, or better said, filing a petition while in the process of making an investment. So this is an opportunity for investors to potentially start their investment, get moving, have their stuff, and get their priority date set in an earlier time frame. But really, I think with some of the changes or some of the outlook of the EB-5 program for this next year could be more and more of a topic and a potential outcome for many investors that we're talking to. So Christian, maybe if you could just give us a little bit of information or the definition of what a partial investment of an EB-5 petition would be.
Sure, happy to. So generally speaking, a partial investment I-526 filing is something in which you're filing your EB-5 petition based on making only part of the required amount of the EB-5 investment. So let's say you invest half of the $800,000 investment and go ahead and file the I-526 petition based on making part of the investment with the intention of completing the full investment at a later date. And so there are some elements that go into that style of filing a petition, but that's just generally speaking what we're talking about when we're saying a partial investment filing.
Great. No, perfect. So what would some of those criteria be that would need to be
yeah.
in order to
So,
do
I'll just back up just quite a little bit. I mean, I worked on my first partial investment filing, I think about 10 years ago now. And back then it was quite an exploratory process. I'm pulling language from the regulations, which says you must show that the investor is actively in the process of making their investment. You also need to show that the investor is irrevocably committed to making their investment in the NCE, in the project. So I used that language to demonstrate back then, and I still do this today, to demonstrate that the investor can go ahead and sort of identify the sources from which their $800,000 investment will come from. We're going to talk about source of funds on those different source of funds items. And then we'll show that they've at least made an investment into the new commercial enterprise. The amount of that investment doesn't matter to me as much, so long as I could show that that investment amount is irrevocably committed. They can't just one day wake up and say, I get to recall my money just like that. It's invested into the new commercial enterprise just like the full $800,000 would be invested in the new commercial enterprise. Beyond that, there should be contracts that memorialize this type of agreement. So we look to the subscription agreement, for instance, or a side letter to the limited partnership agreement that says you as an EB-5 investor subscribing to our partnership with only part of the required investment capital are coming in as a limited partner so long as you complete the remainder of your $800,000 investment in a certain amount of time. And typically, there is an end date on that time period that the investor has to make their full investment. And that initial investment is committed to the new commercial enterprise, as I was describing before. You can't just say it's being held kind of in abeyance or an escrow away from the NCE until the full investment amount is made. So the second part is following through with that full investment, right? So we want to make sure that within the next 3 months or 6 months or whatever that agreed time period is, that the investor does go ahead and invest the remaining amount I then take that information, I try to keep it as consistent as possible with the initial story that I described in the I-526E filing, and then interfile that additional documentation showing the remaining investment was made, that the sources of the funds are lawful, and you, as the NCE, have now accepted that investor as a fully subscribed, fully funded EB-5 limited partner. So those are sort of the steps and thoughts that go into making this all happen when working on a partial investment filing.
Sounds great. I appreciate that, because I think sometimes people look at this and they skip some of the steps sometimes, or they think of this as an installment or something like that. I think the irrevocable nature that you mentioned is one of the key components, and really identifying the entire source of funds that you're going to be going ahead with, that you're not just making it up as you go along and just kind of figuring it out, like as you're making the investment. There is a lot of planning that goes into it, and really the way a lot of times we'll look at it is that this is a tool for executing your plan more so than the plan itself, right? Because, for us, we're a third party regional center. So, when we want to be able to offer flexibility whenever we can to investors. We know that it can be difficult in trying to get your funds ready and wanting to be able to allow people to get their filing in place in a sooner time frame. We want to allow for that, but it really comes down to the borrowers that we're working and their flexibility and their funding schedule, which really dictates how long we can provide, if we can provide flexibility at all for this, so that people can then plan accordingly. But it makes perfect sense that sometimes, we have people that might have a liquidity event that's coming a few months down the line, but they want to still make sure that they secure their spot in the project. They want to make sure that they secure their spot in the queue in terms of their adjudication timeframe. And it allows for them to make sure that they are taking those steps and preparing accordingly to do so. So Christian, what are some of the benefits of being able to go ahead and potentially go ahead with a partial remittance like this?
Sure. So, one of the biggest benefits is just that predictability in terms of going ahead and getting the interim benefits that you might, while in the U.S., be so drastically wanting, like employment authorization or the ability to travel internationally while waiting on the adjudication of your EB-5 petition. One of the things that I see often in clients is a student who's getting ready to graduate from university and not knowing what their next steps will be to remain in the U.S. OPT is sort of a bit of a daunting next step to remain and find a job related to their study, not to mention the whole H-1B process that we all know is very difficult for students who are graduating. And so if the funds aren't quite available for the full $800,000 investment, but there's a property being sold, for example, such a great partial investment scenario here. You can demonstrate that some of the funds are available now and that through the sale of the property later, the remainder of the investment will be made in a timely manner. And now we get to file the I-526E petition, file the adjustment of status application, and go ahead and get those interim benefits sooner rather than later, and the right to remain in the U.S., even if your underlying non-immigrant visa status expires. Another scenario I see is where parents are trying to protect their older children from aging out of the EB-5 immigration process. And so they're trying to get that filing date in to get them protected under the Child Status Protection Act by filing before the child is 21 years old. And perhaps they don't have the funds together just yet, but they have part of the funds and they know where the remainder is going to come from. We go ahead and move forward with a partial investment filing and get it in the door that way to get that Child Status Protection Act going for the family. So those are two that come to mind, but it doesn't have to be quite that dramatic or that sensationalized. It could just be as simple as, I'd like to go ahead and get an earlier priority date than the next EB-5 investor next to me. There is value in getting that priority date, which is the date that you file the I-526E petition, because we all know there will be eventual EB-5 visa backlogs. We don't know what those cutoff dates will be in the future, but what we do know is an earlier filing date means, less delays in terms of being subjected to the EB-5 visa bulletin and the backlogs on that bulletin. So, it is kind of a case-by-case basis in terms of what it might do to help the investor and the investor's family, but those are a few scenarios that come up fairly often, actually. So we're seeing this more and more in the EB-5 space, and I think that's a product of two things. One, it just being a larger investment amount. People don't necessarily have $800,000 of liquidity at the drop of a hat. They may need to be liquidating assets, selling property, things like that. And then the other piece to this is, I think the impending backlogs and individuals wanting to make sure that they get their foot in the door, getting access to those interim benefits of the work permit and the travel permit before they can't do that for at least some time.
Yeah, I think those are, because the thing about a partial filing or is that you still have those benefits from the concurrent filing from an adjustment status. They're still available to you. Your priority date is based on when you file that petition, not when you interfile with the remainder of your funds. So, for these purposes of say maybe getting your EAD, getting those tremendous benefits as you said.
Yeah. And one of the questions I do get asked by newer clients is, will a partial investment affect the processing time of my employment authorization document or my advanced parole travel permit that I get from the EB-5 process? And the answer to that is no. They're not. USCIS is not opening up that application and looking to see if the full investment is made and then asking questions about the EAD and the advanced parole related to the invested amount. Those are separate. First off, they're separate petitions and just separate issues. As you're stating, I mean, those interim benefits, that work permit and travel permit, they're coming from the filing of the application to go through the EB-5 process. And those will hold in place so long as everything goes well through your EB-5 process. And so that's why we then need to follow up with making sure that the full investment's made in a timely manner. I like to see the full investment made and the interfiling occur with the additional documents long before USCIS opens up that petition for adjudication. I like to see it when I've done my job and interfiled and USCIS then opens it up and doesn't even issue a request for evidence on a partial investment filing. They just approve the petition, and then the next step is approving the adjustment of status for the conditional green card. But it doesn't always go like that. Sometimes they'll open up the petition. We may or may not have yet interfiled the additional documents showing that the full investment has been made. And USCIS might come back and say, in the form of a request for evidence, we see that the full investment hasn't been made. This person does not qualify. Show us that this person qualifies. And if that comes up, then that's why we've done our homework and our legwork from the beginning, working with you on the subscription agreement, making sure that the timelines are followed, making sure that we've baked in the details in the initial filing of the I-526E petition, showing that the investor is actively in the process of investing, showing that the investor is irrevocably committed to the NCE, and here's where the funds are predicted to come from to make the full $800,000 investment. And the more consistent the overall story, the much higher likelihood that everything will go smoothly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, all of these things and so many of these conversations that we have, it's about proper planning, and it's about prior planning before you go in with your attorney, with your tax assistants, with your regional center to make sure that you have all of these things squared away before. So when these things come up, you are prepared and you're able to make sure that you have the most approvable case possible. But the one thing I would like to touch on, because you alluded to, is you can't get an approval until you fully funded your investment. You are going to be, there is going to be, when you look at this, you look at the timeframes that people could be looking at potentially for, say, completing their investment, or when they ask how much flexibility they could have. That is something that we bring up, and we always, again, as it bring up the funding that we can, the schedule that we can provide because of the group that we're working with. But that you are kind of putting yourself into a little bit of a logjam during that time frame. So I guess it's a good way of leading into what are some of the things that people should be concerned about or should be especially focused on in terms of risks potentially of a partial filing.
Yeah, great question. So I totally agree with you. I have this conversation again and again. I'd like to go ahead and file as quickly as possible through a partial investment. I'd also like to do this whole process, meaning get the conditional green card as quickly as possible. I'm looking at rural projects as a result, et cetera. Well, we then have to weigh the two benefits and say, well, we want to file quickly on a partial investment, but you also want USCIS to open this up quickly and process your application. Recall that by then you need to make your full investment. So how liquid are you? What is your first priority? Your what's the most important priority of those two? And so you have to kind of weigh the speed of the processing with the speed of the timing and the liquidity of the funds when talking through this process with someone moving, getting started. The other item is, you do have to make your investment into the project for at least 2 years. And I'm not talking about your partial investment. I'm talking about your $800,000 investment. So the longer that you're delaying on making your full investment into the new commercial enterprise, the longer you're delaying your sustainment period in terms of the investment timeline. So that's another, concern to keep in mind if one of your priorities is to be, eligible for repayment at the time that the project pays back the NCE. One other thing I have to bring up is that consistent story and fact pattern that we're describing to USCIS in the initial I-526E petition versus what happens later on. I want that consistency to be there. So in the I-526E petition, in the form itself, USCIS asks, tell us the different sources of funds that you're using for your $800,000 investment. So it's not just, something I like to do for, my own benefit. USCIS is looking to see that in the initial filing. And we want to remain consistent because the last thing we want is any kind of accusation of a material change occurring from USCIS. And a material change on your I-526E petition would be very problematic, could lead to a denial, and then all this planning, goes by the wayside. So you do want to really lock into your potential, sources early on, stay consistent with it, work with your immigration attorney if you feel like there's going to be some changes in the future, and keep USCIS updated. I think it's better in these types of filings to be more proactively communicative than waiting for them to open everything up and say, what is this? This is an incomplete filing. I don't understand, I don't understand how this could at all qualify. I think in these scenarios, the more communication, the quicker you are in updating them in terms of completing the investment and filling them in on your source of funds, I think the better for your petition and your immigration process.
Yeah, no. This is one of those situations too where you have to keep the big picture. You're going into this, you want to get your full immigration status, you want to get your repayment of funds, and you want to make sure that you're picking the correct immigration-linked investment to accomplish those goals. In that immigration aspect of it, you definitely want to make sure that while it would be great to have your priority date earlier, it would be great to potentially get all those benefits that you talked about before. If you're not sure about the other parts of it, you're just causing yourself difficulties down the line. You're just bringing on potential complications that are going to impact that main goal that you're looking at from the top of this conversation, right? So if you aren't sure and if you can't give a good firm description of this to your immigration attorney when they are going and doing this, maybe you need a little bit more time to get this thing prepared. If you're looking at this and you're thinking that your final liquidity probably won't be available till for a year or so, you might want to be waiting until you've got a little bit more of a firm grasp on this, because you don't, where I'd love to hear your thought on how your experience of your clients in these situations, but I would think that it's suboptimal to when you actually have USCIS looking at your funds, even if you're within the schedule that you dictated with your regional center. You've got that if they're now contemplating this and you're not prepared or about to be completing this, I don't know necessarily what complications it could lead to, but I could envision it leading to delays, which again could impact your ultimate pathway towards getting this approval.
Right. So you know, if there's going to be a longer period of time to make that full investment, you do need to consider what kind of project that you want to invest in as an EB-5 investor. I mean, we have seen rural I-526E petitions processed faster than high unemployment urban area projects. We just have, and that's been pretty consistent across the board. And so if you're not going to be able to fund the remainder of your investment for, I think, over 6 months, you really need to shift your attention to high unemployment urban projects. Not to say you can't invest in a rural project. Your I-526E petition might not be opened up that quickly, or maybe it gets opened up at month 4 or 5 or 6, and you're given time to respond in your request for evidence and show that you've completed the remaining investment. But timing of making that full investment really should dictate what kind of project you plan to invest in. I have had scenarios where USCIS opened up the I-526E petition, does not see that the full investment has been made, does not see the remaining sources of funds documentation, and they issue just a very thorough request for evidence asking for all of that information. We respond to those questions and get the I-526E petition approved. It's a very natural process that you see in immigration or in the EB-5 process, where USCIS has questions about the petition, and then you get to work on answering those questions with the supporting documentation. I think it gets a little frustrating when you do actually interfile the documents and USCIS doesn't put together the two files and goes ahead and asks those questions anyway. But I will say, Pete, I think USCIS has become a lot more familiar with partial investment filings over the last 2 years. And I see them being much more consistent in terms of linking interfilings to the already filed I-526E petition, resulting in those, in fewer questions coming from USCIS if they do go ahead and have the complete package and they just process the case normally, which is a really good thing to see.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because I do think that it's getting to be, and just like USCIS is getting more accustomed to it, I feel like the clients that we're talking to are getting a little bit more accustomed to it as well, and understanding that a little bit better, sometimes more than others. But some of the complications that could come from this, because there are also, I think that as you look through and what oftentimes will take some explaining is that, there are the different steps along the process that need to be completed in order to actually have this go through. And so there are the people who are looking at partial remit because they have a liquidity event that's coming later and they need more time to do it. Restricted stock units or sale of a property, something like that has a time frame, and they know what it's going to be, and they know when that liquidity is going to come, so they can complete their remittance afterwards. There are sometimes others that there are people that we'll talk to for whom they just have an investment that is going well for them, that they are getting a reasonable financial rate of return from, that when they look at EB-5, they understand that they want to make that they're going into this immigration linked investment, which is a very unique security for which the outcome of it is a very valuable one. It's hugely valuable. But the value from it comes from your status and your long-term goals of staying within the United States, less than, say, like a monetary rate of return. Right. And so when that's the case, they say, well, if I can get an extra 3 more months or something of that matter in this investment that they appreciate, then they can complete their remittance in 3 months. If that's necessary, then we can try to work with people on those sorts of things as well. But they do also start to get that, if, say, they have an adjustment of status filing in place and they start to get their EAD and they start to get their advanced parole, that starts to become at the point where it does start to feel real, and they start to realize, oh, I should probably, if I'm getting these benefits, I should probably start looking a little bit more at this. And then obviously when it gets really real is when, you know, if they potentially get an RFE because their petition is now being uh, now being reviewed, and they now have a petition that's not approvable because they haven't completed their investment yet.
Yeah, and I mean that could accelerate even the timeline that you had agreed with with CanAm, for instance. If the investor's petition gets opened up faster than expected, well, now you've got a reason why to accelerate that full funding timeline because you want to get that your I-526E petition approved.
Absolutely.
You know, and I
Yeah,
think
the timeline that you get with the regional center does not necessarily coincide with the timeline that USCIS is going through. Far from it.
right,
So
right, yeah, and I mean, and to your point about the different reasons why a partial investment from an economic standpoint, you know, is interesting to an investor. I like to be able to show USCI as much as possible, you know, but for these factors, the investor would already be making their full $800,000 investment, but you know, they just haven't sold this property yet. Or another interesting one is, I think, you know, USCIS, you know, has gotten to know different laws and you know tax laws around the world, and you know, for Indian investors, when the tax year comes up, you know, in April, and they're able to remit some of the investment now and
yeah,
commit to making the remainder of the investment in April or a bit later, I've been able to tell that story, that you know, provide that kind of explanation on our partial investment funding on a number of occasions now to USCIS, and they've been understanding of that. And as long as my client, you know, follows through with that timetable and everything stays the way that we described it would be, I feel very confident with that kind of partial investment filing, and USCIS hasn't taken issue with it.
oh, that's great. That's great to hear. Yeah, because that's a very repeatable. I mean, that happens every year at the end of the fiscal year, and it just makes sense. It's a very realistic obstacle
Yeah.
for investors, and you know that's the type of flexibility that we offer for investors, especially when you're talking about a month or so as well. So I guess I'd like to touch a little bit, I guess, for, you know, what sort of suggestions would you make then for an investor who's looking at this now, who's coming in and they're starting to have a look at what these scenarios might look like and trying to make a decision? Because, you know, as we speak about this, we're in December. We just saw the January visa bulletin, which, you know, brought with it some indications that the set-aside visas that have been so tremendous for the industries could at some point be facing a data function. You know, I think we still have plenty of time before that actually comes in, well into next year at least. But I think that with that and with the reality that this could be a reality at some point next year, that no longer would a US-based investor be able to concurrently file if they are, say, from India or China and are subject to retrogression in the unreserved category. So with that as, you know, a potential outcome for later in the year this year, you know, how would you advise an investor from one of those countries who is potentially starting the process now and looking to make an EB-5 investment?
Right. Okay. So, you know, just it comes down to just weighing these factors, you know, risk versus reward, um, that kind of thought process. So, um, if somebody's in the U.S., for instance, and wants to take advantage of adjustment of status to be able to remain in the U.S., we definitely want to keep that in the back of our mind. We may need to file sooner than we'd like, or sooner than the full $800,000 investment available. If we feel like, if the investor says, "Look, I'll have it in another month or two," it may not be necessary. You know, because we want to get the I-526E petition approved first and foremost, right? So we want to make sure we're not just throwing something against the wall just to get it in the door come, you know, January. It may not be necessary to do that, and it probably will not be necessary to do that.
Right.
Again, we recognize priority dates are valuable. We want to make sure that we're putting together a you know, an EB-5 case in a thorough yet efficient manner, but we've got to consider those factors in terms of how necessary. What's the absolute reason why we're filing this partial investment today versus doing it maybe 3 weeks from now when we have a few more details on the full picture of the case, versus maybe waiting a month or two and filing with the full $800,000 investment, especially if they're investing in a project in which we think their I-526E might get it processed quickly. We want to show that that investment is there. For individuals abroad, you're not dealing with the adjustment of status question as much. It still just becomes I want to get my foot in the door with that priority date, that filing date, and making sure that when there is EB-5 visa retrogression, that I'm not as affected as badly as the person who files after me. So again, we're just looking at, can we stick to this full source of funds story as much as possible? Can we come into an agreement with the NCE on terms of the filing timeline, so everyone's kind of happy with the timing on the full funding coming in and filing a solid I-526E? But I tell every client from the beginning who's looking at partial investment that not all I-526E petitions filed are the same. So, there are full funding filed I-526E petitions, there are partial funding I-526E petitions, and then there are those I-526E petitions that are filed on partial funding without a real plan, without a real roadmap on how it's all going to get done in the next 6 to 9 months. And that is not where we want to be. We need to be in one of those first two buckets. And if we are in one of those first two buckets, we can go through this process successfully.
That's a great way to put it. Because ultimately you have to look at the outcome that you're looking to get. And I think everyone can be it's so tempting to say, let's just get this as quickly as possible. But you said it, fantastically. A priority date is helpful. It's not the end all be all. And so, making sure that you have the most approvable petition possible has to be, the first goal that
Yep.
you go.
Yep, that's right.
So I think that's a great way to go, and I think that would definitely be leading your clients in a great direction. So I mean, Christian, this has been tremendously helpful. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the subject? And
yeah, well, just one final note. It's a very doable process in EB-5 to do a partial investment, go through this process successfully. So if this is something that you're looking to do because you've got a predictable timetable on funding the remainder of your investment, that you can start now and finish in the near future. Maybe you have reasons pertaining to your family or your status in the United States. Really do consider this option. I think the EB-5 community has really done a very good job at coming together, from immigration attorneys to working with regional centers on how to make this a very much more predictable process than a number of years ago. But again, you've got to do this with the guidance of experts and people who are sort of working in this space every day, because this is not a run-of-the-mill EB-5 filing. There's a lot of time and effort that's gone into making sure that this is more predictable than it could be. So I'll end with that note.
Great. Christian, thank you so much for your time. I think that this is very helpful. I hope it's helpful to all of you. Please, anyone who has any questions, please feel free to reach out to Christian. Please feel free to reach out to me, or I can put you in touch with him. I really appreciate your time on this subject. I think it's going to be coming up more and more as we talk to people over the course of the year. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pete. Thank you to CanAm, and I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks, Christian. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.